Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Stephen Blackwood, and I have the great pleasure to welcome you all here to our first online lecture with Dr. Anthony Daniels. I'm not going to make by any means a long introduction here, but I do want to make sure our tech is working and make a few introductory remarks. That music you've just heard was Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. That's BWV 565. If you want to look it up, it was the fugue from that piece, and it actually was written for the organ, but it's played on piano by Gerhard Opitz. It's readily available for download in various places. Anyway, that's the music we use in our podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to make just a couple of quick comments here. I first want to say that we may face all the usual tech toils and tribulations that we have all, I know, gone through in the midst of COVID. Dr. Daniels is at his apartment in Paris tonight, but because of the lockdown and because of the extraordinary internet traffic at this moment in time, despite our best efforts, we could have a little bit of interruption. If that happens, we've pre-recorded the lecture and we will, with a small delay, pick up wherever he's left off. So thank you just for sticking with us. I know we've all gone through these things in the midst of COVID many times. On that note, I really just want to say something very simple by way of introduction to this series, and that is that I don't think I'm the only one that feels that as a culture we maybe are standing on the brink of quite bad things, and that we need perhaps to take a step back and to think and listen, and perhaps to explore where we might find some illumination from those who've faced perhaps similar things in the past. It may also be that we're standing on the brink of wonderful things, but we need to think about it all. So anyway, with all that said, I want to introduce my friend, Dr. Anthony Daniels, who has often written under the pseudonym Theodore Dalrymple. He's written, all in all, I think about 30 books. He's been immensely prolific. He's a doctor in the sense of a physician. He spent many years working as a prison doctor. His reflections out of that time, at least some of his reflections, were published in a book that really made some serious waves for the clarity and beauty and honesty of its insight. That book is called Life at the Bottom. I don't know if you can see this here. I highly recommend it to all of you. It's not just any book that has Thomas Sowell saying on the front cover that this book is as fundamental for understanding the world we live in as the 3 R's. That's Thomas Sowell making a comment on Life at the Bottom, the worldview that makes the underclass by, it's written under the name Theodore Dalrymple. And not to presume where this conversation will go, but I don't think it takes a great leap of logic to see that the role of ideas in the shaping of the underclass that Dr. Daniels describes in Life at the Bottom is a huge theme in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, the relation between ideas and character or life, that ideas, in short, have consequences. So we're going to be thinking about some of those ideas today. The format of this event this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you happen to be in the world, is going to be that I will momentarily turn things over to Dr. Daniels, who will give a lecture that lasts about 40 minutes. That will run straight through. After that, we will then turn to a conversation in which Tony and I will go back and forth with some ideas and thoughts about the book. I will perhaps read a few passages for the benefit of those of you who perhaps haven't had a chance to read it yet. And we will, of course, take questions from all of you whom we have the pleasure of having with us today. Such an amazing and sort of vertiginous and odd thing to think that we're now, in some sense, as human beings, together in our separate places in this moment on the internet. who knows what we can make of these technologies, but we're damn determined to try and do our best. So we will then take some questions from the audience in the midst of that discussion, and it will go for as long as it goes. I know some of you may be on your way to work or on your way home or have other commitments. You may be in your cars. It's an amazing thing. We have hundreds of people here. Just drop off when you need to drop off. This recording will be made available subsequently for distribution. So if you don't catch it all today and you'd like to, you can catch the rest of it later. But there's no set end time. We'll just go until the conversation comes to a natural end and leave it at that. With that, I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Daniels, and I look forward to seeing you all after his lecture. Dr. Tony Daniels, Theodore Dalrymple, welcome very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak to you here today. Here being, I'm not quite sure where, of course, but it would have been a greater pleasure if I'd been able to do it in public, of course, in person, of course, and not remotely. Let's hope that one day it will be possible again to attend convivial meetings and lectures and seminars in person rather than through the miracles of technology. Even without COVID, the Western world has been going through turbulent times, economically, socially, politically, and culturally. Perhaps all times are turbulent, and we just happen to be so constituted that we always think that our own times are the most turbulent times there have ever been. And we believe that there were periods which seem to us to have been placid and peaceful, but they never did, of course, to the people who lived through them. Nevertheless, we still think that there are periods that we are pleased to call normal. That is to say, where most important questions had been settled and all problems seemed to have a solution, at least in theory. And differences were between people were relatively minor. Past travails, however, illuminate present travails. Historical analogies, of course, are never exact, which is why they're analogies rather than repetitions. And the lessons of the past are always disputable. Moreover, there is no human experience, either personal or historical, from which the wrong conclusions cannot be drawn. Perhaps one of the ironies of the present conjuncture is that while multiculturalism is extolled and is almost an official orthodoxy, so many people lack historical imagination and cannot enter mentally into a world in which people have a different scale of values from their own. The past for them is not another country where they do things differently. It is the same country where they did things worse and had much worse ideas. Karl Marx was quite right when he said that men make their own history, but not just as they please. From this well-expressed truism, however, he drew the false conclusion that there existed historical inevitability. In his view, men could have free will only if they were free of all constraining circumstances. But this is not only to invoke an impossibility, but to mistake the nature of infinity. It does not follow from the fact that there are some choices that are closed to me, for example, I can't become King of England, that the number of choices before me is not infinite. A grammar limits what can be meaningfully said, but it does not eliminate the infinitude of what can be said. Well, the great writer Ivan Turgenev was an exact contemporary of Karl Marx. He was born and died in the same years as Karl Marx, that is to say 1818 and 1883. And these were not the only parallels in their lives. They both came under the influence of Hegelianism in Berlin when they were students, and they were both in Brussels when the revolutions of 1848 broke out. They both knew the Russian anarchist Bakunin and were close friends with him, though they both later broke from him. They were both at home in several languages. But as far as I know, they never met. And though Turgenev was born into the Russian aristocracy, his acquaintanceship with actual, real oppression, in this case by his mother of the peasants, whom, as a serf owner, she held as property, and whom she often treated abominably and always arbitrarily, was far greater than Marx's. The latter hated oppression in the abstract and developed an equally abstract doctrine to overcome it, which eventually took oppression to new heights, or perhaps I should say depths. But Turgenev, no doubt, both because of his temperament and his personal acquaintanceship with oppression, hated it viscerally, while remaining clear-sighted about the many possible forms that it could take and the many circumstances in which it could arise. He was not a doctrinaire, and he envisaged no utopias, quite the reverse. His most famous work, though all his novels, his short stories and essays were excellent and have never been out of print, was Fathers and Sons, published in 1861, which was the year of the emancipation of the serfs in Russia and a year before the Emancipation Decree in the United States. It's often said that Turgenev's first published prose work, Sketches from a Hunter's Album, which was read by both the Emperor and the Empress, hastened or brought forward the emancipation of the serfs, though no doubt that would have occurred in due course anyway. In Fathers and Sons, the son of a small landowner, the son called Arkady Kazanov, who's the son of Nikolai Kazanov, returns home to his father's isolated small land holding after completing his university degree. He arrives with his close friend and mentor Bazarov, a student of natural sciences and an aspiring doctor, who is of somewhat lower social class than Arkady, being the son of an army surgeon, and who is, as it were, a prodromal revolutionary, or a revolutionary type. Bazarov is a complete rationalist, that is to say, someone who accepts no authority other than that of his own reasoning and the evidence of his own eyes, on any subject whatsoever. He is a kind of logical positivist, avant la lettre, and the only kind of knowledge that he believes in is that which is provided by scientific experiment, though in fact he is scientistic rather than scientific. He regards poetic utterance and even music as worthless and meaningless. Turgenev coined, or at least made current, the word nihilist through Bazarov's self-description as such. Bazarov claimed to believe in nothing, belief being coterminous in his mind with superstition and irrationality, and hence the term nihilist. Though, of course, it is impossible for metaphysical reasons to clear human minds of all beliefs and presuppositions whatsoever. And in any case, science is not straightforwardly a body of indubitable and positive established truths, as Bazarov appears to think that it is. In this, rather ironically, given his insistence on thinking for himself, he is a follower of the rather crude German positivist materialism in vogue at the time, Buchner being the most famous of them. And of course, it's not easy for anyone entirely to think for himself. In fact, it's impossible. It is the conflict between Bazarov's philosophy and the inevitable exigencies of human life that are the theme, at least to the modern reader, of this great book. Bazarov comes to a tragic end, dying of typhus contracted from performing a post-mortem on a person who has died of this disease, and Turgenev's clinical description of the disease, incidentally, is very accurate. At his death, Bazarov realizes the insufficiency of the whole philosophy by which he has tried to live. He is a man of great probity in that respect. But alas, by then, it is too late. He has fallen in love and is prey to emotions far stronger than his rationalism. But his death, of course, precludes any satisfactory end to his love affair. His friend Kazanov is dazzled by Bazarov's superior intelligence, and even more, perhaps, by the certitude with which he holds his opinions. He has become Bazarov's disciple or acolyte, but he is not made of the stern, single-minded stuff of Bazarov. He's a natural follower rather than a leader. His weakness and vacillation, in fact, is his salvation, at least as far as his own happiness is concerned. He's not the kind of man, any more than was Turgenev, to follow a line of argument and cleave to it, even if it led to a horrible conclusion. Turgenev's own vacillations extended not only to political or philosophical matters, but to personal ones also. His only real emotional commitment for most of his adult life was to Pauline Viardot, who was an opera singer of Spanish descent, married to a man called Louis Viardot, whom Turgenev followed around Europe almost like a lapdog, and with whom he actually lived in a ménage à trois, both in Germany and in France, for many years. Fathers and Sons is a novel of ideas, but unlike the characters in Bernard Shaw's plays of ideas, who often resemble ventriloquist puppets under Shaw's control rather than real living human beings, the characters in the novel express their ideas in a way that is indissolubly linked with or expressive of their character. Though the ideas that they express are fully of their time, a time which, as we shall see, speaks to our own more than a century and a half later to a surprising extent, given all the historical changes that have taken place in the meantime. In short, Turgenev's novel has the feel of lived reality with all the ambiguities and inconsistencies that anyone not in the grip of an ironclad ideology will recognize. It is Turgenev's temperamental vacillation that permits him to see all sides of the situation, though of course I don't mean to imply that all vacillators are Turgenev's. The heart of the novel, as far as the ideas are concerned, occurs in chapter 11. In this chapter, Bazarov has an argument with Pavel Kazanov's, Arkady Kazanov's paternal uncle, who also lives in the house. Uncle Pavel despises, hates, and perhaps fears Bazarov from their very first meeting, and is aware of Bazarov's disdain or even contempt for him. He is determined to have a quarrel with him, as if that would in some way clear the air, as the storm does in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Uncle Pavel is an aristocratic drone, which was in some sense what Turgenev feared himself to have been. Indeed, there are parallels between the author's life and the character's life, though they are not exact, as one would expect from a literary artist of Turgenev's caliber. Pavel Kazanov, for example, has had an unsatisfactory love affair with a woman, Princess R, whom he has followed round Europe with dog-like devotion, much as Turgenev followed Pauline Viardot. Though in the end Princess R dies, and she's mad when she dies, and Uncle Pavel, unlike Turgenev, retires from life permanently, licking his emotional wounds and living on his brother Nikolai's estate. Incidentally, the difficulties that Nikolai experiences in running his estate, and many of them consequent upon the soft-heartedness and the advantages taken of him by crafty and dishonest peasants, parallel those that Turgenev himself experienced in running his estate, from which he derived an income throughout his life, much of which he spent in Western Europe. Turgenev was aware that his literary activities were possible only because of the labor of his peasants, and may have felt considerable guilt about that. In a way, Pavel is a victim of his own good fortune. An exceptionally handsome man, with at least in youth a natural charm, he does not readily have to struggle to make his way. Again, there are parallels with the actual life of Turgenev. At first, Pavel goes through life like a hot knife through butter, but too easy success too early in life, at least in the social sphere, is bought at the expense of failure to strive for anything, or even to appreciate that there is a need to strive for something. Thus, together with his disappointed grand passion, the one of his life, he is set up for a life of pointless, if not altogether unpleasant, existence. He is both fastidious and punctilious. He continues to dress as a dandy, as for drawing rooms in aristocratic Petersburg, though he lives in the utmost rural isolation from society. And of course, given the vast extent of Russia, that is very isolated indeed. He is careful with his ties, his collars, his coats, his hair, and his whiskers, which he perfumes. He follows English fashions of the time. His hands are carefully manicured and, of course, are free from any taint of manual activity. He is intelligent and cultivated, reads German, and frequently uses French expressions, as if they came more naturally to his mind than Russian, as the best way to express his thoughts. He is, in the circumstances, as exotic as a hothouse pineapple in a cold climate. As for his moral qualities, one could not say that he was either a very good or a very bad man, unless, of course, you take Bazarov's view that to live essentially on the labor of others is very bad. And of course, Turgenev himself did live on the labor of others for much of his life. The conflict between Mazarov and Uncle Pavel is, of course, partly generational. In fact, Nikolai and Pavel are not very old, at least by modern standards, being only in their early 40s. But of course, people aged more quickly in those days, and Turgenev himself thought he was old by the age of 42. Furthermore, not all generational conflict is political in nature. Whether intergenerational friction, misunderstanding, or conflict is an inevitable part of the human condition is not a question that I can go into at the moment or at any time, because I have no knowledge of all human societies. But it is sufficient for our purposes that such conflict is by no means uncommon with us. As the old shepherd puts it in The Winter's Tale, I would there were no age between 16 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there is nothing in between, but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancientry, stealing, fighting. And Shakespeare knew whereof he spoke, of course. Did he not get Anne Hathaway with child at the age of 18? When Arkady arrives home from the university, Turgenev very succinctly draws attention to one of the small tragedies of human existence, namely that children often mean more to their parents than parents mean to their children. There's an inevitability about this, at least in societies where children are expected to make their own way in life. On Arkady's arrival, Turgenev tells us, Nikolai Petrovich appeared to be far more excited than his son. He seemed a little flurried and overcome with shyness, the kind of shyness, in fact, that hides an extremity of emotion. Youth is often thoughtless towards age, that is to say, cruel without meaning to be. When just after his arrival, Arkady remarks on the sweetness of the air at home, Nikolai Petrovich, his father, says, "Of course you were born here, so everything is bound to strike you with a special Arcady interrupts him, saying, "But Papa, what difference does it make where a person was born?" "Still," the father begins. "No," continues Arcady, with the certainty that is born of inexperience. "It makes absolutely no difference." And Nikolai Petrovich looks at him sideways. Note how deftly this is done and how much it actually suggests. As we are soon to learn, Arcady has long fallen under the spell of the rationalist Bazarov, who would say something like this if confronted with a father who said what Arcady's father said. "If the air of a place is sweet, it is precisely as sweet as it is, irrespective of where one was born. To say anything else would be to give in to abominable, irrational superstition or sentimentality. The quality of the air is the same for the stranger and the native." This, of course, is a crude kind of rationalism that requires that we ignore the very common, if not necessarily universal, attachment that people form to the place of their birth and childhood, without necessarily claiming that place to be the most beautiful in the world. We love where we have been raised, partly perhaps for its beauty, though many people are nostalgic for places that are very far from beautiful, in fact, quite the reverse, but much more because it is ours. It has a vital connection with our lives and our past. If we have been happy in childhood, we value where we were raised. But in Bazarov's philosophy, we should value places, if we should value anything at all, according to a strict, equal, and objective criterion. But human beings are not like this, and cannot be like this, though Arcady thinks, as Bazarov's disciple, that he himself ought to be like this. Arcady clearly inflicts pain on his father without wishing to do so, through the callowness of youth rather than through malice. His father hopes that Arcady, having come home, will stay for a long time. Arcady's professed lack of attachment to place removes one reason why he might do so, and thus his father foresees that he will not stay long, and this, of course, dashes his hopes and gives him pain. There's nothing political in all this. Such scenes are enacted and such pain inflicted every day, because children inevitably come to make their own lives, at least in non-traditional societies, and separate themselves from their parents. It is one of the prices we pay for freedom of the individual. Implicitly, then, this is a tragic situation, which is to say that there is no solution, least of all a political solution, to the suffering that is caused. Not all desirable things in life, for example, the freedom of children to make their own lives and the desire of parents to remain close to their children, are achievable at the same time. Utopianism, a permanent temptation of the young and of those who decline to acknowledge the complexities and ambiguities of life, is excluded. And this is important because political utopianism was a growing phenomenon in Turgenev's Russia, as perhaps it is in our countries today. But the conflict between Uncle Pavel and Bazarov, besides being generational, is of a quite different order from Arcady's disappointment of his father, and is political, ideological, philosophical, and above all cultural as well. What is astonishing is that despite the very different social, political, and economic circumstances of today, one can easily imagine such arguments in the households of any contemporary Western society or country, where such arguments might break out over any number of subjects, and any one of which might call into question the underlying assumptions and whole way of life that the older generation has hitherto taken for granted. One has only to think of the upheavals in such homes that, for example, demands for the adoption of strict vegetarianism or veganism might cause, or alternatively discussions over the Black Lives Matter movement, to imagine the potential for bitterness and dispute. Moreover, radicalism on one question is likely to be associated statistically, if not logically, with radicalism in another. One could call this another form of intersectionality. At any rate, mutual exasperation and misunderstanding is very common. The cultural dimension of the conflict is extremely important. In effect, Bazarov wants a cultural revolution. Even before his dispute with Uncle Pavel, he has remarked to Arkady on his father's fondness for reading poetry, which he considers useless, time-consuming, and even harmful, in that it discourages the kind of activity that would lead to social progress and is therefore intrinsically conservative of something that should not be conserved. Here I must reiterate that Turgenev was not an opponent of progress and was fully aware of its desirability, having been an effective opponent of the feudalism in the midst of which he had grown up. Arkady, still in complete thrall to his mentor Bazarov, finds his father reading Pushkin and gently replaces the book with one by Buchner, the militant 19th century German physiologist and materialist whom I've already mentioned, who insisted that there was nothing to man but force and matter, and also that his complete happiness would be found in the application of science. Pushkin, of course, was almost the founder of Russian literature and to this day is still considered the greatest poet of his language. So that to replace a book by him by a volume of Buchner might be considered, at least symbolically, the equivalent of pulling down a statue of George Washington in the United States. In recounting the dispute, or skirmish, as Turgenev puts it, between Uncle Pavel and Bazarov, Turgenev does not load the dice. In other words, he does not reduce it to a question of good versus evil, allowing good to triumph by means of a conclusively superior argument. Both characters, Uncle Pavel and Bazarov, are flawed. There are between them not only intellectual differences, but those of temperament and class. Uncle Pavel, as I mentioned, being an aristocrat, and Bazarov being of the non-landed, lower middle class and intelligentsia that was just then emerging in Russia, and from whom many revolutionaries were subsequently to be drawn. It is a tribute to Turgenev's art that we do not feel that any single factor is completely determinant of either of his character's views, which is to say that they are not just caricatures or an ideal type brought on to illustrate a doctrine, but real flesh and blood human beings. Hence, the discussion does not proceed in an orderly fashion, with one of the characters playing the part of Socrates in a Platonic dialogue, but proceeds rather by accusation and counter-accusation, by insinuation and counter-insinuation, as such discussions tend to do in reality. The acrimonious discussion begins when Bazarov, en passant, calls a local landowner a third-rate aristocrat. Uncle Pavel seizes the opportunity for a quarrel and accuses Bazarov of meaning that all aristocrats are third-rate, ex officio, because aristocracy is intrinsically productive of the third rate. Bazarov hasn't actually said this in so many words, but we all know that words may carry a heavier load of implication and connotation than of literal meaning. Uncle Pavel defends aristocracy not so much as a social system, as an ideal. I am seeking, he says, to prove that without a proper sense of pride, without a sense of self-respect, and these feelings are highly developed in the aristocracy, there can be no firm foundation for the social bien public, the social fabric. It is personal behavior that matters, my dear sir, A man's personal character must be as strong as a rock, since everything is built up on it. Here is a reference to a question that even now has not been answered definitively and probably will never be answered definitively, namely, do men make society or does society make men? This goes straight to the heart of the insoluble mystery of being a human being. What makes us? How do we become what we are? Bazarov is clearly of the party that believes in a society so perfect that no one will have to be good. Uncle Pavel is of the opposing view, and it's probably true that the young in general are more inclined to the former, the older to the latter, hence the title of the book. Here I should perhaps add a personal note. I have sometimes had discussions with ardent young people who've reminded me of Bazarov, and in the course of which I've suddenly thought to myself, I am turning myself into Uncle Pavel. Uncle Pavel continues by extolling self-respect. I am very well aware that you are pleased to ridicule my habits, he says, my way of dressing, my punctiliousness, in fact. But these very things proceed from a sense of self-respect, from a sense of duty. Yes, sir, of duty. I may live in the country, in the wilds of the country, but I do not let myself go. I respect myself as a human being. This self-praise, not surprisingly, gives Bazarov an opening. He says, interrupting, allow me, Pavel Petrovich, you say you respect yourself, and you sit with your arms folded. What sort of benefit does that do the bien public? If you didn't respect yourself, you'd do just the same. There is obvious justice in Bazarov's retort and reproach. Uncle Pavel's punctiliousness clearly partakes of vanity and self-regard, and furthermore does not benefit anyone other than himself when he happens to look in the mirror or parades himself in the house. There is no one to admire him or be grateful for his dandyism. And yet Bazarov's argument does not quite settle the matter, for there is no doubt that even if self-respect is not the true motive of Uncle Pavel's punctiliousness, yet self-respect is genuinely enough a virtue. Uncle Pavel's punctiliousness requires an effort, and in other circumstances, in a city, say, an effort made for the sake of others, or at least for the opinion of others. Someone with this kind of punctiliousness must at least be aware of others and try to enter their minds, to see things from their point of view. Contrary to what we might at first have thought, punctiliousness of the Uncle Pavel kind may result from a concern for others, not for the self, though of course it may not. And like any virtue which is taken too far, it may become a vice. Compare this punctiliousness with the extreme casualness of the way in which we dress now. Do we not, by the way we dress, in effect say to others, I'm not going to make an effort just to please you? Those of intellectual bent may add in their thoughts, my mind is focused on higher things than mere appearances. And thus an asocial mass sloppiness results. So in this part of the argument, Uncle Pavel and Bazarov are both right and wrong. Sincere reflection on this ambiguity would tend to break down the binary political culture to which Russia was increasingly becoming prey, and which in the end was to produce such a catastrophe. 50 years later, the Tsarist Russian Minister of the Interior was to say that the epileptics of the revolution were opposed by the paralytics of the government. And we see this ab ovo in Uncle Pavel's disputation with Bazarov. The epileptic, or perhaps I should say choreiform, which is a more accurate neurological analogy, the choreiform nature of Russian radicalism is clear from the continuation of the discussion on the matter of principles. Bazarov claims to have no first principles. But the belief that one should have no first principles is itself a first principle, and therefore his philosophy is self-refuting. Again, I'm reminded of the self-refuting philosophy of the logical positivists, who claimed that a proposition was meaningful either if it was by definition or by potential correspondence with an empirically testable state of affairs, itself a proposition neither true by definition nor testable empirically, and therefore, by the standards of the argument, itself meaningless. Unfortunately, the incoherence of a philosophy does not make it harmless or lacking in influence, quite the reverse. In the course of the discussion, Bazarov says, "We base our conduct on what we recognize as useful. In these days, the most useful thing we can do is to repudiate. So we repudiate." This, of course, horrifies Uncle Pavel, just as the young nihilists of the present time horrify their elders, such as the speaker. "Everything, Uncle Pavel demands to know everything," replies Bazarov. "What? Not only art, poetry, but also, I'm afraid to say it." And Bazarov, with great composure, repeats, "everything." Surely in Bazarov we can hear the voices of young people in Western society today who claim that their own societies have been built on nothing but force, fraud, massacre, injustice, slavery, and so forth, and therefore everything must be swept away, as if they were trying to clear a jungle in order to start a plantation, which of course is not a very good idea, since a jungle, though luxuriant to all appearances, often grows on thin and vulnerable soil that swiftly erodes when cleared of its native vegetation. Since all our institutions have been founded on this history of force and fraud, the past existence of which can't be denied, there has, of course, been force and fraud and all the terrible things I've mentioned, it is necessary to begin again from scratch, without respect for or even awareness of the slow accretion of achievement that has enabled us to live as well as we do live now, by comparison with most people in history. One must construct too, says Arkady's father rather weakly in response to Bazarov, but Bazarov simply brushes him aside and says, "That is not our affair. The ground must be cleared first." Then there is the question of whether the nihilists like Bazarov, who are very small in number, can in practice affect any change. "Do you think that you can take on the whole nation?" asks Uncle Pavel, to which Bazarov replies, "A penny candle, set Moscow on fire." This, of course, is a reference to the burning of Moscow in 1812 during Napoleon's invasion. Bazarov says this, "A penny candle, set Moscow on fire," not as a warning or as a call to prudence, but as a message of hope. He wants Moscow and everywhere else to be burnt down, razed to the ground, at least metaphorically, so that everything may be built up again on sound foundations, for example, of equality. At this point, I doubt that many people in America, and probably many people in other countries, all of which are based more solidly, so it seems, than Tsarist Russia in the 1860s was, will not think of the effect that a very small percentage of the population has had very suddenly on the various countries, and how what seemed so stable, almost immemorial, now appears extremely fragile. And of course, we cannot read Fathers and Sons without knowledge, which Turgenev himself could not have had, of what was to happen less than 60 years after its publication. It is impossible for us not to regard Bazarov and his nihilism to be a kind of harbinger for the disasters to come, albeit that he himself was not going to experience them. During the Soviet period, indeed, Bazarov was taken to be an unequivocally positive hero. His morality was a slightly weaker version of the morality of Lenin, for whom whatever served the revolution and the establishment of Bolshevik power was good, whatever hindered it was bad. Indeed, morality had no other meaning. Repudiation of everything else was necessary. For example, the repudiation of normal human decency and kindness, which were regarded as mere petty bourgeois sentimentality, and even the beauty of music. Lenin couldn't listen to a Beethoven sonata because, he said, doing so sapped his revolutionary ardor, precisely as Bazarov might have said or warned. And he did, in fact, find it ridiculous that Arkady's father should be playing the cello at the age of 44, the advanced age of 44. Our knowledge of events subsequent to the publication of Turgenev's great book prevents us, I think, from responding to Bazarov as anything other than a revolutionary prig. But this was not how Turgenev saw him. On the contrary, he was very sympathetic and in some sense loved him. He is said to have cried as he wrote of Bazarov's death, which is indeed very moving. At the end of his life, Bazarov has found love, which, too late, he realizes is more important than philosophy or social revolution, for a world without love would not be worth working for. And since love is achievable in the present world, that world cannot be so totally bad that everything must be swept away before starting all over again. Thus we see at base that Bazarov is a tragic figure, not a villain, mistaken but not deeply evil. Again, this might inhibit us from too rapid and gratifying a division of humanity into the good and evil, though this is also not to deny the potentially appalling effects of radically mistaken ideas. Lenin once said that Bernard Shaw was a good man fallen among Fabians, by which he meant, such was his ethic, if ethic it can be called, that Shaw would have been a better man if he had slaughtered his audiences rather than entertained them. Bazarov, by contrast, is a good man fallen into ideology, albeit, of course, that he must have had some affective affinity for ideology in the way that his friend and disciple, Arkady, ultimately did not. Well, I've only touched on some of the depths of Turgenev's book, which is among the best expositions known to me of the inevitable reciprocal imbrication of character and thought, and the effect of thought on politics. Perhaps in 2,000 years, no one will have the faintest idea what Turgenev was writing about. But for now, 160 years later, he remains astonishingly, if disturbingly, contemporary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a shame that you cannot hear the applause of the couple of hundred people who are here listening to this wonderful lecture you've given us, both deep and incredibly succinct. You touched on many of the abiding themes in this novel. We have quite a number of really superb questions here, and I want to get to those fairly quickly, though I want you all to know there in the question queue that we're going to get to as many of these as we can, so keep them coming in, and we're not in any particular time limit here. But I want by way of beginning our conversation, Tony, to dig in a little bit further into Bazarov's standpoint, and which, of course, is the standpoint that is Turgenev is himself wrestling with. It's the standpoint that, as you say, in so many respects, leads to Lenin and Stalin, and to various forms of burn it all down standpoints in our own time. But Turgenev is very, very careful. One of the things you said in your lecture that I thought was very rich. You may hear my dog barking in the background here. This is Zoom in all of its glory, folks. You said that these are not puppeteers, these characters, not as though he's taking an ideology and just putting in someone's mouth. He's developing a full human person to show where these ideas lead, the way they manifest themselves. Bazarov is for all the way in which he seems to be a voice of a certain ideological position, is also a real human being with virtues, with sensibilities. But let's just start with this, because I want to pick through a few things in Bazarov and see the way in which Turgenev in this absolutely masterful novel brings out the limits, both the truth and the limits in this position. You said earlier in your lecture that Bazarov was not actually a scientific, but scientistic. And I want to start there with a sense of what you mean by that, and then perhaps we can build on that to better fill out the whole of Bazarov's position.
Well, a scientific person is a person who actually knows about science and uses science to discover things about the world. A scientistic person thinks that science itself is sufficient to explain everything. And in essence, everything is understood, bar the shouting. I mean, there are details to be filled in, but in fact, this scientism is still with us. For example, in neurosciences, many people think that we have finally achieved self-understanding, when it's clear to me, at any rate, that we haven't, and we probably never will. But Bazarov thinks that science is everything, insofar as he indulges in any science as far as the book is concerned. He goes around catching frogs, which he's then going to dissect. But we know really he isn't going to discover anything. This is more a pose, actually, than a real scientific inquiry. Maybe this is because Turgenev himself wasn't all that knowledgeable about science, but we feel that Bazarov's desire to dissect frogs, go around collecting frogs before anyone else is up in the house, and then goes and dissects them. We know he's not going to discover anything that isn't already known. It's a kind of pose. Not I don't mean by pose in the sense that a poseur poses, but it is to reject any other view of life that he does this, and to shock.
Well, I think this is very interesting, because Bazarov claims that he has, no principles. They recognize no authorities. You bring out in your lecture the contradiction in that standpoint. He says, I'm thinking here, I hope, if above all, what comes out of this is that many people will read this novel who've not yet read it. In the 10th chapter of this book, he has this moment in his exchange with Uncle Pavel, in which he says, he talks about all these useless words. Even principle is a useless word. Later, he denies that even materialism is as a word adequate to his standpoint. So there's this kind of complete refusal of any kind of, while he portrays himself on the one hand as a rationalist, as kind of relentlessly rational, he is on the other hand unable to engage with the intellectual implications of his own position. So he says, for example, that they renounce all principles. Only what is useful will they acknowledge. But of course, by what standard is something to be acknowledged as useful? Yeah. That implies a whole hierarchy of value. Similarly, he says that he at least makes the pose of dissecting the frogs, and yet even the pose of dissecting the frogs is it suggests that there's some good, some knowledge to be gained in this encounter with nature, that somehow your knowledge will become more adequate or more realist or more complete or more grappling with the truth of reality is something that he surely would want to be to champion, and yet he's unable to acknowledge any of those implications of his own declared position. And the reason I want to get at that is because it does seem to me highly relevant to certain moments in our own day. This claim that we must repudiate everything. He says everything. Everything must be repudiated. And I think just after that passage where you beautifully described to us, Pavel says. He says. You think we must repudiate everything. He says, you are destroying everything, but one must construct too, And to that, Bazarov replies, that is not our affair. The ground must be cleared first. And he goes on then to say in another passage, we must smash people. We need fresh victims. So what I want to ask you, Dr. Daniels, is about whether, let me first say that Turgenev is very clear that Bazarov, as you say, whom he does not dismiss as a mere ideologue, that Bazarov has some genuine insight into the state of Russia, into the injustice, into certain political and familial and other dynamics, that his perception of these injustices may indeed be accurate. But he seems to be suggesting that those injustices cannot be remedied from a standpoint of repudiation. And I'd like to ask you what you think are the limits or possibilities of repudiation, and whether a more constructive standpoint is possible.
Well, two things come to mind. The first is, of course, that Bazarov actually, as you were describing him, it occurred to me that he's very Nietzschean, actually. Nietzsche wanted to destroy the whole of philosophy and so on, and claimed himself to have no first principles, really, and said that there are no facts, there are only interpretations. But whether it is a fact that there are no facts, only interpretations, he doesn't question. I think if we look at Turgenev's own life, the fact is that he saw very clearly the terrible things that there were in Russia and was an opponent of them. But at the same time, he valued the civilization of which he had been able to take advantage. So he did not want just to clear the ground and start again. But he knew that underneath the things that he valued, there was a subterranean, or not even very subterranean actually, substructure of great injustice. And it was this that was very difficult for him. And in particular in Russia, because there was really no tradition of gradual reform. And anyone who tried to reform was treated as a kind of violent revolutionary. Although later, in the reign of Alexander II, there was real reform, and the assassination of Alexander II was a catastrophe. He was assassinated on the day on which he was going to grant the first constitution to Russia. And from there, things didn't look back. But there is this, it's very difficult for people to keep in their minds both that there are things worth preserving and there is great injustice in the world. And this is the difficulty that Turgenev himself had personally. So, as you say, he recognized that Bazarov understood that there were things wrong, terribly wrong with Russia. But Bazarov's philosophy is in fact extremely weak, because you can't criticize anything unless you've got a standpoint from which to criticize it, and that requires principles.
Yeah. In the end, Bazarov is shown to have a contradictory standpoint, exactly as you say, that the very power of his insight is inert because he won't acknowledge the principles that are implicit in that very standpoint. And that's where it seems to me this novel is such a powerful powerful overcoming of a nihilistic repudiational standpoint, because continue.
What I might say, however, is that Uncle Pavel, who's not a fool, doesn't argue against it very well. He doesn't argue very well against Bazarov. He doesn't point to the logical contradictions in what Bazarov is saying. He merely finds it repellent.
I'm so glad you made this point, Tony, because it seems to me this is also highly relevant to our moment. That on the one hand, we have all kinds of burn it all down revolutionaries with whose critiques of injustice are often accurate and powerful and necessary. And yet, insofar as one takes a standpoint of critique that will not acknowledge one's own principles, then you have an inert position that is unable to redress the very injustices you see. So that is to say that it seems to me Turgenev's position is you can't address injustice by acting unjustly. You have to actually know what justice is, and justice must be instantiated in your own remedy to injustice, just as you can't address ugliness by building more ugly things. You can't address unkindness by being yourself unkind. So he's really pointing out the inert contradiction, the hypocrisy, as it were, in Bazarov's standpoint. And yet, what's so marvelous here is that the so-called conservative Uncle Pavel, though he has a genuine perception of the goods of rationality and civilization, he's unable to be an articulator of those things in such a way that Bazarov is able to grasp that. And I think that's clearly one of the crises in our own moment, is that those who call themselves small c conservatives, I don't mean in a political sense, I want to hasten to add, I mean in a broad sense of there being something in the culture of the past that can illuminate our current moment. Those people have shown themselves almost without exception unable to transmit what they see to the young. And so it seems to me Turgenev's position is not by any means simplistically on Uncle Pavel's side.
No. On the other hand, there is also the fact that he clearly, Turgenev himself, did not believe that justice was the only value. So, of course, it was important, but it's not the only important thing. So that it might well be true that, for example, St. Petersburg was built by the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, completely, a huge injustice. But the solution to it is not to pull St. Petersburg down or to say that St. Petersburg is not beautiful. And so Turgenev values justice, but not only justice.
Yes, well, clearly the standpoint, and we'll dig into this as our conversation continues, in Turgenev is very powerfully non-reductive. He is, in a way, I wonder whether you agree with this, Tony. As I have reflected on the novel, which I had not read until you offered to give this wonderful lecture, I've been thinking about what the fundamental oppositions are, and it seems to me that it's by no means rationalism versus the non-rational, because actually in the end what clearly is the case is that Turgenev proves to be more rational than Bazarov. His observation is more adequate to human nature. Bazarov's pseudo-rationalism proves to be irrational because he's unable to account for, he is inchoate to himself. He's unable to give an account of the love that eventually he cannot even answer or respond to. So he's actually not the trenchant observer of the world or the master of observation that he wants to claim to be. Whereas Turgenev himself, the power of the novel, as I think your lecture brings out beautifully, is in the nuance and subtlety of the observation that allows the truth of these various positions, the falsity of these positions to be revealed. But what I wanted to ask you is whether the fundamental opposition here is not rationalism versus non or irrationalism, but in a way it's ideology versus openness. And so Turgenev is not trying to replace Bazarov's position with some reductive sense of what justice is, but with a sort of superabundant, brimming sense of the real, that somehow we are all in and need to answer to.
Yeah, and that desiderata are not all achievable, and that they're in conflict. So that there is no perfect state for man, and therefore utopian ideas are foolish. And Turgenev didn't, of course, live to see just the disaster that would come from trying to build a utopia with the idea of perfect justice and so on. So yes, I mean, it's a profoundly anti-ideological novel. He's not saying that there is some philosophical scheme by which we can achieve a perfect life. On the contrary, anyone reading it would come to the conclusion that that is completely impossible. And it is a great mistake, a terrible mistake, to think that there is. But we must also remember that there is a generational conflict too, such as we have seen many times.
There's just before we move on to our first question from the audience here, Tony, and I want to intersperse reading a few passages in our conversation, beautifully translated, by the way. Tony and I have both been reading the version of this text that is translated by Rosemary Edmonds, with a marvelous introduction by Isaiah Berlin. And I want to bring out the anti-individual strain here, that for all of Bazarov's claim to be the analyst, he's utterly disdainful of the particularity of nature. And this came out marvelously in your lecture about how the air has to smell the same to everyone. There's no sense in which there's a home in which we find ourselves. So Bazarov says, in the first place, experience of life does that. And in the second, I assure you, the study of separate individuals is not worth the trouble it involves. All men are similar in soul as well as in body. Each of us has a brain, spleen, heart, and lungs of similar construction, and the so-called moral qualities are the same in all of us. The slight variations are of no importance. It is enough to have one single human specimen in order to judge all the others. People are like trees in a forest. No botanist would dream of studying each individual birch tree. In an age of one-size-fits-all top-down solutions, Tony, would you like to make a few remarks about Bazarov's position in relation to particularity and individuality?
Well, that again would come from his scientism. Because it is true, for example, that most of our physiology is very similar, and he would say that we are just physiology, and therefore it follows that that the differences between us are very minor. It's a bit like people who say that we share 99% of our genes with chimpanzees or whatever. People are or 70% with snails, and therefore mankind is 70% snail. So he's got that kind of mentality, and unfortunately, we know what that kind of idea leads to. But it was very current in his time, and I think it's still quite current.
One thing I wanted to note here is how powerfully Edmonds makes this point in her introduction to the novel about how Turgenev's, when you mentioned how Turgenev's novel is itself not rigidly, it is not itself at all ideological or rigidly reductive. He's opening things up to the complexity of reality. And one of the ways one sees this is that he refuses to coerce his own characters, and he refuses to coerce the reader. I was astounded at the light touch of the novel, the way in which he's aiming to depict these positions with sensitivity and observational power. And you can make up your own mind, though it is at the same time clear that there is Turgenev is acutely aware of the limits of these of the position of Bazarov, for example. But one of the other ways you see this is in his depiction of the natural world. This of the springtime, of the birds, of the trees, of the movement of the sun on the and shadow. And it seems as though, there's that wonderful moment where Arkady's father is outside in a kind of reverie, in a kind of contemplation with nature. And it seems that Turgenev is suggesting that the human relation with nature is, by contrast with Bazarov's standpoint, is a window into the richness of the real, not a clinical reduction of it.
Yes, and is available to all people and will be available for them for all time, at least if the whole world is not concreted over. and all other living creatures are killed. But yes, so there is something that transcends politics. Politics is not all. In fact, it's important, but it's not all important. And for Bazarov, of course, he's ultimately motivated by hatred of what already exists, and therefore can't appreciate. He can't appreciate the beauty of anything. You could describe a fanatic, or you could define a fanatic as someone who looks at beauty and sees injustice. And Bazarov is of that kind. He's obsessed by the wrongfulness of the world. And of course, there is a great deal of wrongfulness, but it's not all that there is in the world.
Yeah, Bazarov's standpoint is to perceive the wrongness, but then to advocate further wrongs. Well, let's turn to some questions. There's a number of other things I want to ask you about, and we may even play some music or read some other passages in this amazing novel. But here we go. We've got lots of questions here. Here is one. You bring up the theme of the connection between rationalism and nihilism in Fathers and Sons. Many see the Enlightenment and rationalism as a serious achievement of the West, though others have pointed out that a purely rationalist viewpoint is behind the Marxist and Stalinist projects. And the planning model that would take hold in the 20th century, even now in COVID, where statistics and virus cases seem to be the Bible that determines our lives through policies. Furthermore, rationalism has extracted a lot of the character of life out of our lives. Could you comment on the connection between rationalism and nihilism?
Well, yes. Rationalism is not the same as rationality, of course. Rationalism is the idea that there is a kind of rational solution to all of life's little problems, whereas nobody can be completely irrational. No, I don't think anybody can be against rationality. Rationalism is the idea that all that is necessary in life is rationality, which is a bit like it is to rationalism is to rationality what scientism is to science. And of course, if you believe that there is a rational solution to all human problems, you will believe that you have that solution. And that will, of course, lead to terrible dictatorship. Whether that is quite the same as nihilism, in a sense, when we think of nihilists now, when we think of nihilism now, we think of people who think that life has no worth, life has no meaning, and I suppose the greatest example is Macbeth, when he says that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps on this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And that's what we think of nihilism. Bazarov isn't a nihilist in that sense, because he obviously believes that there is a better world possible. So there's more than one sense to the word of to nihilism.
But that, of course, gets at the very contradiction within Bazarov, in which he's unable to give an account of the principles according to which that better world could be constructed. So he's or moved towards, and that's the fundamental hypocrisy of the position we were talking about a moment ago. Related to this, another question from David Donegan. Can you elaborate on the conflict Bazarov has with the ideas he learned at university regarding nihilism and the real-life emotional feelings he has by falling in love with Anna Sergeyevna, and how this was tearing at his core values?
Well, if you have principles which are suddenly or fairly suddenly revealed to you as being not in accord with your real wishes, your real desires, it is, of course, very disturbing. And most of us have faced that. I think at some time we've had principles which we suddenly realize are inadequate to the situation that we face, and that our desires are actually different from those that our principles tell us that we really ought to have. And most of us have had and probably still have those kind of conflicts. It's particularly acute, of course, in Bazarov, because he's made his philosophy the whole focus of his life in a way that most of us don't. And there's something very, in a way, admirable about it. In a way, he's kind of saint, you could almost say. He forgoes everything that is desirable in life for his philosophy, but then finds at the end he cannot carry it fully, he cannot carry it out, and actually something else is much more important than his philosophy. Most of us avoid that by not having a philosophy that entirely dominates our life and dominates our action.
There seems to be another alternative there, which is to keep one's philosophy open to the complexity and nuance of life, and to have one's ideas revised by the experience of reality, which is surely what philosophy and being rational is. I mean, I think this is the tension with Bazarov, is that he proves, though his commitment to a kind of rational standpoint, he has such an ideological rigidity about what he's willing to admit to be real, that he's ultimately destroyed by that which he cannot acknowledge as real. And that is, in a way, the standpoint that we see again and again in the Greek tragedies too, that the very those things that are real which you will not acknowledge will destroy you, not externally, but in yourself, as in the case with Bazarov. We have a number of questions, Tony, coming in. A great deal of gratitude for your work, admiration for your work, some very touching notes here. Several questions pertaining to your life as a doctor and in relation to the novel. So one person asks about, as a doctor, can you say more about how Turgenev's writing makes his characters seem real?
Well, you've touched on that, in that they are not just spokesmen for ideas. They are whole human beings with the conflicts of whole human beings, and they are individuals. I can only say that in my work, there is always a in a medical life. There's always a conflict between seeing people as a case of something and being individuals. Everyone, I mean, you want your doctor to recognize the disease in you, which is similar to the disease in other persons, but at the same time, you want him to recognize you as an individual. And I think a good doctor manages to balance that, not necessarily by any intellectual process, but does it almost instinctively. And so that this is what Turgenev obviously does. I mean, he's obviously interested in his characters as individuals, but also not only as individuals. They do stand for something, but they are not just standing for something.
I want to relate two questions here, Tony, in my effort to get to as many of these in our time as possible. Another comes back to the question of human nature. It seems, this questioner writes, that the author portrays an idea that truth cannot be ideologically dismissed, as Bazarov seems to try and do. Can we have some sort of confidence that Turgenev reveals nihilism to be at natural odds with human nature, in spite of socialism's attempts to the contrary?
Well, I think it does show that nihilism is against human nature, in the sense that Bazarov falls in love, and love is much more important to him in the end than philosophy. But unfortunately, his nihilistic philosophy. But unfortunately, it's too late. One of the things that it teaches you is that things can be too late, and so not everything is reparable. But clearly, there's a conflict between his nihilism and his real deepest feelings, and that's why, of course, Bazarov is not ultimately a bad man. He's a mistaken man, a man who's made a very serious mistake. But because he is actually capable, in the end, he's capable of love. If it hadn't been for the fact that he died, he might have been redeemable. He would not have remained a nihilist all his life.
There's a real sense of that in, it's just such a beautiful novel. I've been really moved by this portrayal of Bazarov, the humanity of the man that transcends his own position. And there's a beautiful metaphor. I think one of the great strengths of Turgenev, this is the only thing I've read, but one of these just breathtakingly artistic aspects of this novel is the way in which he will often use natural contrast or juxtapose moments in nature with moments in the human being, in the soul or in the person. And there's that wonderful moment, and I hope those listening here, if you haven't read the novel, that you'll give yourself the benefit of doing so at some point. In chapter 17, there's this moment where Bazarov is confronting the fact that against everything he believes about himself, he's fallen deeply in love with this Odinstov character, and he's unable. This is the irrational side of his rationalism. He's unable to account for what's happening in himself, and this beautiful moment where he gets up and he opens the window. They're in the drawing room and they're sort of socializing after dinner. Bazarov got up and pushed at the window. It flew open at once with a crash. He had not expected it to open so easily. Also, his hands were trembling. The mild, dark night looked into the room with its almost black sky, its faintly rustling trees, and the fresh fragrance of the pure, untrammeled air. This just magnificent sense of the natural world, the way in which his opening of the window, he's overwhelmed by the beauty he didn't expect, by the darkness of the night that he didn't expect, as a metaphor of the ways in which he is himself overwhelmed in this very conversation with his own feelings that he did not expect and cannot account for in his conversation with this woman that he's fallen in love with. On this topic of human nature in a fuller, broader sense than Bazarov is himself able to express, but which in a way he is an expression of. Someone writes, Dr. Joseph writes, good evening, Mr. Daniels. I have been deeply influenced by your work, particularly in your insights into human nature. Taking everything you have experienced and read into account, are you optimistic or pessimistic about human nature? Can we learn from the mistakes that we British, this person clearly writing from the UK, have made by having a more realistic view of human nature? Thank you very much for your time, and I must express deep felt appreciation for everything you have written. Britain is so much the poorer for your retirement from the Birmingham prison and hospital. Regards. Would you like to respond to that, Tony?
Am I pessimistic or optimistic? Well, so the thing that did make me a little optimistic, not very optimistic, was that I was, when I spoke to my patients, I never didn't say to them something that I was prepared to write. And they recognized, I think they recognized the truth of it. And they also quite liked being talked to as full human beings rather than as vectors of forces. So that I always acknowledged that they had made decisions, albeit that they'd made decisions in very unfortunate circumstances, but nevertheless they were decisions. And so they were prepared to recognize that and were actually relieved that someone talked to them as if that were true, and they recognized it at once. So that makes me optimistic. On the other hand, we have a very large part of the society now which has a vested interest in treating another part of society as if they were mere objects, and that makes me pessimistic. I don't think human nature is going to change either for the better or for the worse. It will always be more or less the same, but at least within very broad parameters. But I think whether realism can overcome the vested interests which there are in irrealism, in one could almost call it Bazarovism, I'm not quite sure. I'm rather pessimistic about Britain in particular, I must say. So I'm not quite sure whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic.
Tony, the thing I always love about talking with you is that perhaps like Turgenev, whom I know you greatly admire, you have a very measured realism about the dark sides of our nature. And yet you yourself are such a life affirming and loving character with your humor and the deep sense of humanity, the deep, the integrity and possibility and respect for the individuals whom you write about and whom you encounter. I have the pleasure of knowing you as a friend, so I know these things are true. It seems to me that that is precisely what it to take that position, as it were, both to be aware of our darkness, but not to surrender to that as a total principle, and to know that our refusal to surrender to that is itself a rational standpoint born of what we know about the nature of ourselves and of reality broadly is that is the only antidote to that. And we're going to speak about that a bit later, I hope. I want to read in a little bit some. I'll just do it right now, and then we'll come back. There are a number of other questions we're going to get to. There are a number of contrasts here. We've talked a lot about Bazarov, but he's not the only character in this wonderful book. You have, in a way, just as you have in Anna Karenina, a kind of fundamental contrast of two couples. So too in this, you have a contrast between Bazarov and Odintsov on the one hand, and Arkady and Katya on the other. And though Arkady, I don't, of course, I don't have any Russian. I have no idea how to pronounce these names. Please forgive me, everyone. Though Arkady is under Bazarov's spell at the early part and throughout the novel, it turns out that he's not a nihilist, that he has a fundamental openness to the ways in which he is moved by the world beyond himself, in his father, in his burgeoning love with Katya, indeed, even in his love of Bazarov. He at times has to repress himself from saying the things he wants to say to Bazarov, because he'll feel like he's not a good nihilist by talking about his love or admiration for this man. And so too in the kind of final, very sad final conversation that Bazarov has with Arkady. There are other things he would say, but they would seem sentimental, so he won't say them. And there's that kind of denial of what's welling up in him as a human being towards the world. And that, to me, is what, in a way, is really the essential character of Bazarov's position. It's that refusal to be open to the way in which the self opens up to the world. That is not comprehensible by his declared principles. And yet we see in the novel a number of contrasts with that position. And beautifully, some of these are given to us in people who are portrayed as very simple in a way, but as having a grasp of deep things that Bazarov himself does not understand. And two of those people are, in fact, his parents, whom he is human enough to recognize the virtues of, though he's unable to, you might say, give himself over to the truth of their position. He sees their virtues. But there's this just absolutely stunning moment at the conclusion of chapter 21, where Bazarov has come home after a long period away. His parents are just so touchingly moved by their so touchingly expressive of their love of their son and delighted to have him at home, and they're fussing over him and they're doing this and they're doing that, and I think anyone who has had the gift of a loving parent knows what that is like, and any parent who's had the gift of loving a child knows what that is like, and how different those two positions are too. But there he leaves prematurely after only 3 days, and they're just absolutely devastated. His father is thunderstruck and he reels. He just can't believe his son is leaving. And as they try to put on a brave face, but as the carriage drives away, he has gone, left us, he faltered. Gone because he found it dull with us here. I'm a lonely man now, lonely as this finger. He repeated again and again, and each time he thrust out his hand with his forefinger, pointing away from the rest. Then Irina Veslavnia came to his side and pressing her gray head to his gray head, she said, "It can't be helped, Vasya. Son is an independent person. He's like a falcon that comes when he wills and flies off when he lists. But you and I are like the funguses growing in a hollow tree. Here we sit side by side, not budging an inch. It is only I who will stay with you always, faithful forever, just as you will stay with me." Vasily Ivanich took his hands from his face and clasped his wife, his friend, more warmly than he had ever done before, even in their youth. She had consoled him. She had consoled him in his grief. Pardon me, I get emotional reading this beautiful novel. Then later, there's a moment after Bazarov has died, and his parents are grappling with his death, and they stand together. And Turgenev writes, "Side by side, they bowed their heads like lambs in the heat of noonday. But the blaze of the noonday sun passes and is succeeded by dusk and nightfall. And then the night, with a return to the quiet fold where sleep, sweet sleep, waits for the tormented and the weary. 6 months went by. White winter had set in with the cruel stillness of cloudless frosts, with its thick crunching snow, rosy hoar-rimmed trees, pale emerald sky, smoke-capped chimneys." Anyway, he goes on and on here in this marvelous contrast of the way in which the sadness is compared to the lambs bowed in the heat of summer, and then gives way to this contemplative distance of winter. And all of this, in my reading of the novel anyway, we see Turgenev giving us this just deeply movingly sympathetic account of the simple love of the parents for the child, this selfless love, as he describes it in the last lines of the novel, which outward movingness we see also in the descriptions of nature and the superabundance of spring, for example, in which the novel begins. That inner reciprocity to reality itself. I'm wondering, Tony, just having read those passages, if you have any comments on, you were saying how Turgenev is not reductive. It's not just a philosophy like this is the nature of things, but there's this opening up that's constantly coming through the novel. Any thoughts or reflections on that?
Well, it just the passages you have read show in a way they don't. He doesn't say it explicitly, of course, because he's not the kind of man, not kind of writer to be explicit, but shows you, if you like, the shallowness of all attempts to understand life through some kind of ideology or simple philosophy, such as Bazarov. Bazarov's philosophy is actually extremely simple, and we realize from reading the end that it's very shallow. that life is much deeper than can be caught even by a much more sophisticated philosophy than Bazarov's, and that well, as I suppose Goethe said, grey is theory, but green is the tree of life, and this bears that out.
I'm going to move back to a few. Thank you, Tony. I'm going to move back to a few questions from the audience. We'll go for a few more minutes if you don't mind. There's so many rich things to speak about here. Here's a question. Here, gosh, so many wonderful questions. I'll try and run through a number of these. Okay. Pardon me, everyone. These are going by so quickly. I'm just trying to focus on them. Here we are. You contrasted Turgenev's comparatively oblique and elusive expression of his worldview within his fiction with Bernard Shaw's more direct and didactic habit. Isaiah Berlin's Romance lecture on fathers and children, which is in the introduction of this book here, also observes that Turgenev is far less forthcoming in his views than, say, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. Can you say a little more about the dangers and possibilities, aesthetic and philosophical, for effecting social change or moving individual readers of being more or less direct in the expression of a worldview through fiction?
Well, I think if you can affect large numbers of people through fiction in a very direct way, the chances are it's a very bad fiction and not a very good book. Lenin's favorite novel, for example, was Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done. And it's an atrocious book, but it's very didactic as to what the situation requires. As for Tolstoy, I think he's probably best, almost entirely best, when he's not obviously pointing to some kind of political or philosophical point. And Dostoevsky is, to my mind, most important in establishing that there are very deep currents, sometimes of evil in people, and that again he obviously believes that there is no ideology that will save mankind, no secular ideology. But unfortunately, he does have some very nasty ideas, Dostoevsky. I think Turgenev is actually the most civilized of them. Yeah, sorry. Go.
No, I don't mean to interrupt you, Tony, at all.
No.
There are a number of questions that may be related here. One person asks, what is the difference between ideology and real thought?
Ideology is, I think, the preemption of understanding, the belief that you understand everything from the point of view of a single or very small number of principles, and that you claim complete understanding before. I don't believe there is any such thing as a complete understanding, but you claim complete understanding. And we've seen several examples of this. Marxism is a kind of a claim to complete understanding. Freudianism was, behaviorism was, neurosciences are taking over that view. So I think that's the main difference. Perhaps it's the closing of the mind in the belief that you have already understood the most fundamental questions, and that all, if anything remains to be filled in, it's just a few details.
A related question comes in here about the. It begins with a note of gratitude to Tony. This reader says that in her reading that the characters demonstrated a lack of self-examination or self-reflection, and not failing to examine the premises of their actions. And the questioner concludes with this question: how do we teach ourselves and others to do this? That is to examine our own positions.
That's a very difficult question. We can be helped, I think, by reading people like Dr. Johnson, who said, who often began, "He who examines the motions of his own mind." That's what we infrequently do. So we don't actually examine ourselves. But how you're actually taught to do it, I don't know. How you actually learn to do it, I don't know, other than by, I suppose, reading literature. But I have no solution to, or no answer to that question.
Well, I'm going to ask you another unanswerable question then. Now that we've got started with these dynamics, writes one questioner, Tony, are ubiquitous now, including in my own family with my daughter's BLM sympathies. What is the antidote when our children reject their parents completely by alienation? Gosh, this is heartbreaking. Such as my daughter manifested in the destruction of the family unit today. You alluded in your lecture to the ways in which this dynamic between generations and specifically as it's animated by by a kind of absolute demand of certain positions leads to fragmentation. This questioner has really put her finger on something very personally rich that we perhaps have all experienced. Tony, what advice or reflection can you offer us on how to engage in the midst of these absolute demands that can so easily be alienating of the things that we love and the people whom we love?
Well, the first thing is I think people shouldn't actually despair, because this doesn't necessarily go on for the rest of a person's life. I mean, people do grow out of things. And I'm sure most of us have grown out of something or other. So it's not that there's no hope. Children often do go back to their parents. You remember what Mark Twain said, when I was 19, I thought my father was completely ignorant. At the age of 21, I was surprised to find out how much he'd learned. So I don't think there's need for despair, because things will change. I hope that most fanatics, most uncompromising people will learn to compromise in the end. As to how to deal with this, my own technique increasingly, it's taken me a long time to realize this, is not to engage in the argument in the first place and try to let it wash over you. And with a bit of luck, if you don't respond too much, then the other person loses interest. But once you start arguing, you do become like Uncle Pavel, and you start saying illogical things yourself. So those are two things. But I can't say that there's a guarantee of success. Some fanatics remain fanatics throughout their life, but most probably moderate. So there is, I would say, there's hope. Actually, it's very painful, and it might take a few years, but the daughter will probably come back.
There you go with your marvelous optimism again, that the human mind is somehow capable of coming to uh, a deeper grasp of what's real. If
Yes,
only.
well, I've made lots of mistakes in thinking that this adolescent is so awful. There's no hope for him. You know, he's obviously going to end up with a life imprisonment or something. And I'm surprised a few years later to find that he's a very nice chap and has changed very fundamentally. And that change can occur surprisingly late in life. So I am, I mean, I don't want to be like Pollyanna. I don't want to say this happens in every case, but it probably happens in more cases than it doesn't happen.
I don't think anyone's going to accuse Theodore Dalrymple of Pollyannaism, but I think you are articulating, Tony, wonderfully the, if I may put it this way, the principle that's at work in the novel, which is the way in which our reductions are reprimanded by reality itself. If we're open to seeing its complexity, we can move deeper into it, and that's essentially what you see with Katya and Arkady. It's what you might have seen with Bazarov
If
had he not died. It's a beautifully sensitive depiction of him as still having in himself, despite his ideology, the possibility of transcending it. There's another question here that is on a similar note. I think it's very good the way you've said that there are times when it's not that one is rejecting argument, it's that there's times that argument isn't possible. It's not the mode of engagement that's most useful. This questioner asks, what strategies could be used today to fight back on the radical movements, both on left and right, in a way that would bring love, peace, and justice to the world instead of causing more anger and polarization? Clearly a question at the heart of the novel.
Well, I'm not sure that love, peace, and what was the other thing?
Justice, I think it is.
Justice, oh yes, yes. I don't think the world will ever be a place of love, peace, and justice completely. And I wouldn't aim at trying to bring about perfect love, peace, and justice. I think it's important to try and get people to appreciate what actually exists. And that, of course, is much easier said than done. I was very impressed once in Brazil. I went to a school, it wasn't in the poorest area, but it was not a rich school. And what the teachers were doing were, I don't know with what success, but what they were trying to do was to get the children to look around them and see how marvelous the world was, how much more marvelous it was actually than what they were seeing on their telephone screens and other screens. And so they were trying to interest them in the natural world, which of course in Brazil is extremely abundant. So it's an attempt to try and get people to appreciate what actually exists. Unfortunately, our educational system doesn't seem to be doing a very good job as far as that is concerned.
Well, that leads to a question, and we won't go on too much longer here, though. Now that we have you here on a roll with all these questions, I'm loath to close off too quickly. How can the youth, this questioner asks, it's a topic on education, Tony, how can the youth best educate themselves in the humanities today? Most of the universities seem to have been slowly moving away from holding truth and beauty as their primary values and seem to have shifted their focus towards political problems, sometimes in a biased way.
Yes, well, I suppose people should go, instead of studying history, they should go and study entomology, and then become, if they're interested in history, amateurs of it, rather than try and do it for a degree. Because as far as I know, I'm not a university type, but as far as I'm aware, the university humanities departments have been completely destroyed from within by political correctness, by political obsession, I should say. And my own view is that, for example, literary criticism is possible only outside the universities. The only people who write interesting literary criticism are not in universities. On the whole, I mean, I'm sure that there must be exceptions, but I think it's a question of parents trying to help children rather than expect universities or schools to do anything, because as far as I understand, I might be exaggerating, but there's no hope for university departments of humanities.
That's a sobering standpoint, but it is, only someone who's not paying any attention at all would, I think, or who is themselves in the grip of a very totalizing ideology would maintain that what is really the heart of Bazarov's position is not, in fact, really a very dominant standpoint in our culture and in the humanities. We see this everything from the ugliness of our architecture to the darkening of the horizon of what we can become of human beings, to the suppression of essential human activities like freedom of thought and speech, but above all, for that darkening of the possibilities, that degradation of the possibilities for how we can interact with each other. It seems to me that the sort of neo-Marxism or Marx, the reductivist materialism that Bazarov champions is in fact a very, very dominant standpoint in our own world, certainly in many universities and in the humanities especially. And if anything, this humble little initiative with your wonderful lecture and our conversation is meant to show that there's another way, as Turgenev himself, as Turgenev's novel itself shows. I am going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to conclude with. I'm going to play a little music in conclusion, and then we'll just have a moment or two to conclude our back and forth. Here we go. The final question I want to ask you here is, forgive me here, everyone. Thank you for waiting along here. The last question I want to ask you is coming from, here we are, about rebuilding. It seems that there is a fascination in humans with destruction. Why do you think this seems to be stronger than the need to rebuild? And I would ask, in addition, do you think it is stronger?
Well, first of all, iconoclasm has a very long history, as we all know. And if we examine ourselves, I think in a small way, we all understand the attractions of destruction. At least I do. So that if I'm I have to restrain myself when I'm very angry not to throw a plate at the wall, and somehow the destruction of the plate, I feel, would relieve me. So destruction, and I remember as a child taking croquet mallets to a radio that was in the shed and smashing it to bits. And when I look back, how much I enjoyed it. And I'm reminded of when I happened to be in Panama when there were riots going on. And it was perfectly obvious to me how much people enjoyed the riots. There's nothing as pleasurable to some people as the sound of a brick going through plate glass. And I think there is something in human nature. Maybe nobody in the audience has experienced anything like this. As for construction, unfortunately, our present mode of construction is destruction. I mean, to construct is to destroy. You can see this in many cities. In the city that I am, Paris, where it's less bad than in London, but still it's pretty bad. Every single building constructed from the Second World War has done something to uglify the city. And it can't be that this is just accidental or that nobody's noticed. So there's a destructiveness. I would say our architects are worse than ISIS or the Taliban in this respect, in the sense that they've destroyed much more than ISIS or Taliban have done. So I think the impulse to destroy is very strong, and it's particularly strong in our era, perhaps because we have a kind of exhaustion of our own cultural tradition that you can see in music, that you can see in architecture, even in literature. And if you have no capacity to create, you can at least destroy.
Before we conclude, two last things here. Tony, you've just been speaking about the will to destruction. What does it mean to create? I mean, I think we're all overwhelmed with the alienation, the sense of tearing it all down, and just the grim gruel, the thin gruel we're often expected to live on. And of course, we here at Ralston College are engaged in an effort to build something new. But I want to conclude our discussion by asking you about what it means to live in a more affirmative standpoint, not denying or in any way suppressing the injustices or uglinesses of the present, but rather to counteract those from a positive standpoint.
Well, I'm not sure I have any prescriptions, but I've been more of a diagnostician than have any therapeutics to offer. What I've just been thinking about the urge to destruction, and part of it comes from the inflamed individualism of our times. And I can see this in Paris, for example. Before the First World War, much architecture was extremely good. And what you see on the buildings is a very little plaque which just gives the name of the architect. It's a very small thing and you wouldn't notice it. And you don't look at the building and think, that's a work by Monsieur Dupont. But it says Dupont architect. And it's obvious to me that at that time, architects understood that a building was part of a collective, part of a collective endeavor. But with the inflamed individualism of our time, that is no longer possible for architects, or they want to mark their cities. So I think we have to try and get over this kind of individualism. But how we do it, I can't really say. This if inflamed individualism. I'm all in favor, of course, of the freedom of the individual. But the strange thing is we live in a state of extreme individualism without individuality.
Well, that is, of course, the position of, in a way, of Bazarov, the inability to actually be an individual. I mean, to be a more fully realized individual would be for him to embrace his love for Odinstov and his friendship with Arkady and the principle of reciprocity with his parents. So he'd actually be a fuller individual for acknowledging this inner reciprocity to things rather than the closing down of ideology. Well, just before we conclude, I thought that for those that one thing that might be nice as a way of concluding this event, this conversation with all of us spread around the world in our cars and Zoom rooms and iPhones or whatever it is, would be to try and give an example in a non-dialogical form of what that openness might look like. And there's this beautiful moment in the novel where Arkady and Bazarov are out in the garden talking, and they hear a cello being played through the window, and it's playing Schubert's playing a Schubert song. Just the melody, it says he's being played sort of emotionally, playing it with feeling, and the melody flowed sweet as honey through the air. And this produces in Bazarov this disdain. You know, your father's far too old to be playing the cello. I think he says he should sort of know better, kind of thing. And then right after that, Bazarov exhorts Arkady to give his father something sensible to read, and he gives him Buchner's. You mentioned Ludwig Buchner's Stoll und Kraft, or I don't know if it's Kraft und Stoll. German work of materialism, which you can easily get on the internet for those of you who are interested in engaging with that work. So you have this kind of contrast on the one hand of Buchner's work as this ideological position that Bazarov is advocating, which is a kind of a closing down to the rich possibilities of life, and then you have the Schubert on the other hand as a kind of symbol or moment of a kind of openness. And so I'm just going to play. I happen to find a lovely recording of not that particular Schubert a song, but another Schubert lieder adapted for cello and piano. And I will play you. It's about 4 minutes, and then we'll conclude our conversation very expeditiously after that. But I thought this might be a nice way for us to conclude our chat. Sorry, I had to get that music stopped there after it. I had a hard time getting it stopped after I started it. Isn't that a metaphor for how we hope such things will go? Tony, I want to, before we conclude, just give you a chance to make any concluding remarks you might like to make. You've been so gracious to write this brilliant lecture for us and to give us the benefit of your time and your long and deep insight into human nature and into this wonderful work of literature. Is there anything you'd like to say to those listening before we conclude?
I don't really think I've anything more to say, except that I hope that those who haven't read the book will read the book and that they will find it as inspiring as obviously Stephen and I have found it.
I think I had another problem with my audio here. Am I back?
You are with me.
Tony, listen, I'm only trying to conclude and say thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and Tony for your brilliant lecture and lovely engagement this afternoon. To all of you, until next time, goodbye.